And welcome to our last day, second and last day of this conference. Today there will be two sessions, basically. We will have a very short coffee break or no coffee break. So if you, no, but anytime you can go get your coffee and drink it here. So the first one is a work in progress by graduate students, postdocs, and coming from UCLA, UC Berkeley, University of Indiana, Bloomington, and our graduate students, promising young scholars who will show us what they are working on today. So I'm really grateful for you to be here, support this important moment. Notwithstanding the rain, people here complain that it never rains, but so thank you for bringing the musicological cloud to us. This session is entirely organized by Sarah Miller and Anushka Kulkarni, so please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Are you able to hear me all right? Awesome. So I'd like to welcome you all to the Emerging Scholars panel this morning. I know 9 a.m. is a bit of a push, so thank you all for joining us. My name is Anushka, and I'm a PhD candidate in musicology here at Davis.
And I'm Sarah Miller, a co-organizer of this Decentering Opera Conference and also PhD candidate here at UC Davis.
So Sarah and I organized this panel to showcase the work of junior scholars, all of whom are at varying stages in their academic careers. Their work engages innovative approaches and poses insightful questions that really speak to the broadening scope of opera studies. And I'm very excited to hear from them throughout this session. Already it's been really wonderful to connect with you all throughout yesterday's conference proceedings. Before we hand over the panel to our speakers, Sarah and I would like to take some time to introduce our own research projects and their intersections with the notion of decentering opera. So I'm currently working on a project on opera in South Asia that engages sites, composers, and works located outside conventional centers of operatic scholarship. My approach is grounded in a post-colonial approach to historical writing. I begin my study in early 18th century London, a pivotal time in the history of British-Indian colonial encounter. Alongside the social and political instability of the Mughal Empire during this time, the East India Company, a joint stock company founded to facilitate Indian Ocean trade, solidified its economic monopoly and established itself as the chief colonial power on the South Asian subcontinent. As the company's mercantile relationship with Indian sovereigns transitioned into that of a colonial company state, and as the British Crown and economy became increasingly reliant on overseas enterprise, discourses on governance, expansion, and racial difference developed to sustain the ideological premises of empire. It is at this juncture in the early history of the British Empire that Handel was producing opera seria that both reflected and facilitated the socio-political and intellectual tensions of an expanding Britain. Examining the representation of Indian subjects in Handel's 1731 opera, Porro, Re del Indie, I analyze how he both dramatizes historical events from Alexander the Great's Indian campaign and allegorizes political moral ideologies entangled within projects of imperialism and colonization in India. My chapters on Handel opera seria ultimately wrestle with both the ambivalence of early 18th century discourse on India as well as the ambiguous conception of the European self, other, and empire at this time. The second part of my dissertation moves from Hanoverian London to the colonial metropolis of 19th century Calcutta, which is present-day Kolkata in West Bengal. By the 19th century, the British administration had assumed this conscious role of civilizing Bengal through developments in the cultural sphere. Theatrical institutions served a significant role in entwining the cultural and political policies of British-occupied Bengal. In my dissertation, I consider the significance of Calcutta's Grand Opera House as a paradoxical site for both British imperial power and its empire's resistance. This colonial venue, whose facade can still be seen from Kolkata's New Market, was built in 1867 to house Augusto Cagli's Italian Opera Company. In 1872, however, this space was also leased to the Hindu National Theatre, and the new Bengali works of Michael Madhusudan Dutt, as well as Dinobandhu Mitra, for instance, shared the stage with the likes of Verdi and Rossini. Through archival research, I'm in the process of constructing a reception history of this opera house and its diverse theatrical productions. And finally, I turn to observing the impact of colonial encounter on the creation of new Bengali Giti Natya, or musical dramas. In particular, I studied two Giti Natya written by Bengali polymath Rabindranath Tagore. The first one I look at is Valmiki Pratibha, which was produced in 1881, and Chandalika, which was produced in 1938, just a decade before independence in India. Both Giti Natya draw from the eclectic influence of European opera, Irish and Scottish melodies, Hindustani classical, and Bengali folk music and dramatic traditions. And thus, they exemplify British Indian colonial encounter mediated on the musical dramatic stage. With nearly 60 years between their composition, the two pieces also offer insight into vastly different sociopolitical and discursive moments during the British Raj. Ultimately, both the presence of Italian opera in 19th century Calcutta and the creation of new, culturally hybridized Bengali musical dramas challenge a Eurocentric conception of operatic history, and by extension, demonstrate that the history of empire belongs just as much to the Indian subcontinent as it does to the British metropole. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to hear about her work.
My dissertation investigates performances of disability in opera throughout the long 18th century. I primarily focus on the works of Venetian dramatist and librettist Carlo Goldoni, as his poetical texts for opera center around comedic representations of difference. On the surface, Goldoni's early libretti appear to rely on uninspired, stereotypical representations of disability. When investigating Goldoni's works through the lens of opera buffa, character typing, however, it becomes clear that Goldoni creates new stock characters, simultaneously relying on stereotypical portrayals of disability and challenging conventional understandings of disabled agency and the stock character system itself. My dissertation challenges current musicological understandings of the character type model and explores the multiplicity of disabled embodiment as it appears in Goldoni's comic operas. The gobbo, or hunchback figure, flourished in 18th century Europe, receiving frequent depictions in opera, art, and theater. A figure of intrigue and disgust, the hunchback was shrouded in mystery, as its portrayal was constantly changing. Unlike traditional commedia dell'arte characters, who wore character-specific masks and performed fixed personality traits, the hunchback embodied a range of characteristics, professions, and ages. The hunchback called into question the concept of fixed identity, as well as the convention of differentiating characters based upon hyper-specific physical traits. Due to this character's flexibility, I contend that the hunchback functions as a quasi-stock character in the 18th century opera buffa model. Through its frequent, diverse, yet still recognizable depictions, the hunchback simultaneously reinforces the stock character model and transforms the model, tying the character more closely to a specific work rather than its character type origin. Furthermore, the fluidity of the Venetian gobbo stock character points to a period of flux in the 18th century Venetian society, which simultaneously was negotiating the significance of so-called deformity as well as the role of commedia dell'arte in opera buffa. My most recent chapter follows the development of the hunchback character into the 19th century with La Esmeralda, the 1836 French opera based on Victor Hugo's acclaimed novel Notre Dame de Paris, with music by Louis Bertin and libretto by the novelist himself. La Esmeralda interplays with visible disability in a variety of significant ways, as both the Quasimodo character, known to modern audiences as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and the opera's composer, Louis Bertin, were visibly disabled. I dedicate a significant portion of this chapter to the biography of Louis Bertin, in the hopes that musicological scholarship will begin to prioritize celebrating the achievements of disabled composers. Interpreting Hugo's novelistic representation of Quasimodo alongside Bertin's musical depiction of the bell ringer in his aria, Mon Dieu jamais, I paint a nuanced understanding of disabled experience in 19th century France. Further, I investigate the role of narrator and narrative perspective in the formation of disabled characters. And I contend that Bertin imbues the Quasimodo character with her lived experiences as a disabled woman, breathing new life into the bell ringer and forming him into a complex disabled man. In the planning of this conference, I've learned much about the logistics involved in implementing accessibility into academic spaces. These issues are particularly personal to me, as I developed a variety of chronic illnesses throughout my years as a graduate student. My medical struggles have forced me to acknowledge the academic, mental, emotional, and financial barriers that prevent disabled scholars from thriving in academia. Although I still have much to learn in terms of accessibility, I hope to see music academia become a more inclusive space. These changes must be widespread, spanning from music conferences and professional relationships to undergraduate classrooms and recruiting processes. In his 2020 presentation at UC Davis, called Musical Instruments Enabling and Disabling, Blake Howe used musical instruments to exemplify how everyday items in our musical world accommodate able-bodied humans. A flute, for example, accommodates a human player with 2 arms, a tongue, lips, and lungs. As musicology continues to learn about the needs of students and academics alike, I hope to see a push towards accessible practices that benefit the diverse bodies of academics. So at this point, we would like to pass the mic to our panelists. Each participant will have the opportunity to present their work for approximately 5 to 10 minutes, and instead of engaging in an immediate question and answer discussion, we're going to hold that until the end, until after all of our scholars speak, and then we want to have a discussion between our panelists and all of you scholars. So during this portion of the session, you may direct your questions and comments to specific individuals or to the entire panel. So now let's welcome our first speaker, Sam Nelson, and I'm going to switch mics in a dramatic exchange as he says that.
It's right here. Thank you so much.
Can everyone, is this mic on? It is not. Yep, okay. Samuel A. Nelson is currently pursuing graduate studies in musicology at UC Davis. His passion for musicology was ignited during his undergraduate years at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, where he explored the historical trajectory of the hurdy-gurdy and its utilization or evocation by composers across different eras. During his master's degree at the Hart School, Sam leapt to the 20th century, culminating in his thesis, Conversing with Brahms, Luciano Berio's transcription of Clarinet Sonata, Opus 120, number 1 in F minor. At UC Davis, Sam continues his research on Berio's work while expanding into new areas such as investigating how jazz diplomacy contributed to discourse on civil rights during the Cold War. Outside of academia, Sam enjoys playing the washtub bass, and Spoons did not know that, in the UC Davis Bluegrass and Old-Time Strings Band. So, hand it over to our speaker.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome for both of you, and also for putting this panel together so we can all have an opportunity to talk and share a little bit. So, in queer opera, Andrew Sutherland alerts readers that the transgender community occupies a space in the queer spectrum that requires increased understanding, and much work still needs to be done to fully embrace the needs of a small but growing sector of the community. In 2014, composer Laura Kaminsky, in conjunction with librettists Mark Campbell and Kimberly Reed, made a significant impact on transgender representation with their chamber opera As One. The work focuses on a single transgender character, Hannah, and represents what Hannah or Kaminsky refers to as a journey to self-discovery. Now, by centering just on Hannah's story, the creators put every audience member in her shoes as we experience Hannah's funny, awkward, heartbreaking, and triumphant moments from her early teens through college. The performing forces are intimate, with Hannah being realized by a baritone named Hannah before, and a mezzo-soprano named Hannah after, and underscored by just a string quartet. With its powerful message and portability, As One has been performed 50 times since its premiere in 2014, emerging as one of the most performed contemporary operas. Now, from the onset of the opera, Kaminsky, Campbell, and Reed envisioned their work as an open and inclusive space welcoming diversity. However, limited by opera performer demographics, they found that the role of Hannah was often represented by cisgendered performers, typically a male baritone and a female mezzo-soprano. Thus, the 49th performance of As One on November 20th, 2022, on the Transgender Day of Remembrance, was monumental in that it was the work's first performance to feature a non-binary baritone and a trans mezzo-soprano. Now, given this work's contribution to transgender representation and its impressive performance record, I was surprised that it's received little scholarly attention. I stumbled on this score in fall 2021 and have encountered few people that have heard of this work, let alone listened to it or watched it. Although I imagine that these informal poll statistics would change as I stand before a room full of dedicated opera scholars. So, when I was presented with an opportunity to dig deeper into an opera, I knew immediately I wanted to talk about As One. As a cisgendered, heterosexual male, it's not my place to comment on the hardships, the validity, or the experience faced by Hannah and the greater trans community that the story represents. Though, as a fan of opera and someone that believes in this work's message, I want to offer what knowledge I do have in a conversation with Kaminsky's work. My contribution focuses on some of the musical and textual decisions made by Kaminsky, Campbell, and Reed in their construction of As One. I begin by briefly discussing the opera's introduction, which links Hannah's persona to the viola and presents her journey through this musical representation. Next, I examine the relationship between the two voices and Hannah's evolving sense of identity, looking at the distribution of musical material and the connection between the text and the two voices. Finally, I shift to the text itself, discussing several references that provide a deeper reading into this narrative. Now, in an interview with Kaminsky, she revealed this direct connection between Hannah and the viola. By interpreting Hannah through three mid-register instruments and voices, the viola, baritone, and mezzo-soprano, Kaminsky clearly attempted to avoid the polarizing dichotomy that males sing low and females sing high. The linkage between Hannah and the viola is established visually and aurally in the opera's introduction. The viola first enters in measure 13 with this bluesy, rhythmically free, loose, and soulful solo, laden with triplets and quintuplets that contrast the driving quarter note rhythms in the preceding violin. Now, the opera's opening thus provides this brief snapshot into the trajectory of this opera. The score indicates that the quartet should be on stage when the audience enters, and that the viola should be depicted separately from the ensemble, either through staging or lighting. The viola's removal from the ensemble represents the isolation that Hannah felt as she warred within herself. In measure 13 here, she finds her voice and embarks on this path to self-discovery with this newfound knowledge, represented by this free and soulful solo entrance. Finally feeling comfortable with who she is, she realizes that she is not an island, and with the viola physically joining the ensemble in measure 18. Here's a little taste of that sound. idea of being an island is one of the textual references in this work that contributes to a deeper reading of the narrative. Entire of itself is the fourth song in this opera and is part of the tetralogy of songs that relates to Hannah's conformity to gender norms. After a brief musical introduction that features a low cello and a high violin, Hannah before, Hannah after, and the members of the string quartet emulate a classroom with the conductor playing the role of the teacher and each performer reciting "No Man is an Island" by John Donne. Donne's poem centers on the idea that all humans are contributors to a greater good of mankind. There's an emphasis on interconnectedness, dependency, and the importance of the individuals that comprise a society, that the loss of an individual through isolation or death is a deep loss for humanity. Hannah responds to this in her classroom by standing up, standing against a, quote, sea of non-islanders, to declare that she is, in fact, an island. This reference in part 1 of the opera foreshadows her self-imposed isolation in part 2, as she avoids her family and home for the holidays, a theme that is continued in part 3 when Hannah embarks on a solo journey to Norway. While isolated and alone in nature, she continues to face challenges, but she was finally able to face them as Hannah. And when she overcame those challenges, she overcame them as Hannah. It was through this isolation that she realized that she is not an island, that she is strong and that she is capable. She then celebrated the ending of her isolation by writing dozens of postcards to friends and family. This moment of realization is reflected musically as the two voices, the two parts of Hannah, are joined together in unison, singing as one. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. All right, so our next speaker today is Ingeborg Dalheim. She is a Norwegian soprano who combines Baroque music and contemporary music with a touch of Norwegian traditional singing. She studied at the Norwegian Academy of Music with Barbara Schlick at the Hochschule for Musik Köln, specializing in Baroque opera. As a soloist and an ensemble singer, she has an extensive international career and has collaborated with some of the best-known names in early music. In 2019, she was awarded a 3-year Norwegian State Artists Grant, and in 2022, she released her first solo album, For One, For None, featuring contemporary music for solo voice, hand in hand with Norwegian folk songs. She is a PhD candidate in artistic research at the Norwegian Academy of Music and currently living in Los Angeles as a UCLA Fulbright scholar. Let's welcome Ingeborg.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anushka and Sarah and Pier Paolo, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So this picture illustrates the starting point of my project. I was looking into a gramophone and wondering what's in there and how can I get in there. So before that, I had already been studying, learning folk music by listening to old recordings. So it was a very familiar way for me to learn music, but I had never done that in classical music. Contrary, I was always told during my training as a classical soprano never to listen to other singers. Don't listen to recordings. Don't listen to your colleagues because they're not like you. When I said to my teacher, it feels really good to sing with her. Yes, but remember, you are very different. Yes. But in the folk music, it was the opposite. Listen to this recording and listen to it again and again and again and again. My teachers would actually not speak. They would just sing. So they sang the song, I repeated. They sang it again, I repeated. They didn't say what was wrong, like do more like this. They just sang. So it was this kind of different, fluent way of existing together and carrying on the tradition. So, this thought occurred to me, maybe there are recordings of Norwegian classical singing that I could actually learn something from. So the path was from the Norwegian folk singing, and also from my almost 20 years of experience as a classical singer, traveling and earning my living from singing. If you sing early music, you're supposed to know something about historically informed performance. So basically we live in this illusion that we try to sing and perform in a way that may sound like it did in 1705 or whenever this work was first performed. And Norwegian early 20th century music, no one had ever looked into that. Maybe a little bit late 19th century, but mostly instrumental music. Vocal music, not at all. And then there's this Norwegian folk music learning by ear. The first recording I found, or actually heard rumors about, was this recording of Nina Grieg, who's the wife of Edvard Grieg, the Norwegian composer, and her 1897 recording made in Paris. So I'm going to play a little of that for you. It's not a complete recording, and so my initial idea was maybe I can complete it, you know, like sing the rest of the song and see her as my teacher. Hi-fi. So this is one of the first weeks that I'm together with the pianist Eloisa Amaral, and she's a vital part of my project. She has also promised to learn only by ear, and if it's difficult for me to learn by ear, imagine how it is for a pianist. You could hardly hear any piano in many of the recordings. So we're folding this score together and putting it into an envelope, and we will not look at scores for 3 years. So to ensure we only learn by ear, maybe we'll look at some. So my plan was to listen and to repeat, and then somehow to recreate. I will not go through all these parts because I don't have the time for that. But I had to find out what is it I'm listening to. I didn't know anything about gramophone recordings, so this has been a very steep learning curve. I've learned so much. And the question was, of course, where do I find all these recordings? So I had to understand the physics, and I had to create a discography, basically a list of all the recordings that were made. And these recordings were not easily found. I was a bit naive. I thought, like books and newspapers, surely some public archives have kept one of each of the recordings that were made. Not at all. Most of them are in private collections, and they are very difficult to get hand on. And if you might be able to look at it, but you will never be able to listen to it. So here's the recording and how it might look. This is from the acoustic period. There were no electricity involved. There was no electricity, no microphones. They all had to sing into the same tapered horn. So you can see that recording device is standing here on the table. And that's the singer. So the instruments are placed according to how loud they can play. And the double bass is not there because it would never reach the tapered horn, so there's a tuba instead. And the pianist is placed on a platform so that the piano would actually reach the recording. And he was a very important pioneer for recording folk music in Norway at the turn of the century. I believe bought his own portable recording device. Okay, so here's the discography, the list of all recorded songs. It's a long Excel sheet in case you love those. I found 334 relevant recordings, so they are female classical Norwegian singers recorded in the acoustic period, from the first in 1904 and then until 1920 when I stopped because I realized 334, that's enough. I'm never going to learn that. So 90 of them I have been able to retrieve as sound files. And Edvard Grieg is the most recorded composer. So historically, this is a period where Norway is becoming independent from Sweden in 1905 after 400 years of union with Denmark and 100 years with Sweden. So it was really, independence was important. And Borghild Bryn Langgaard, the one that you just heard, is the most recorded singer. And here is the list of composers. So the most recorded is Edvard Grieg. Then the second is actually a woman, Agathe Bakker Grøndal, which is kind of surprising, I guess. And you can see that also Puccini and Wagner, they're quite popular. And the most recorded song is Ole Bull's The Herd Girls Sunday. It's recorded 9 times by 5 different performers. And this is really interesting for me because I'm looking for the style, the collective style, and not the personal style. So by learning the same song from 5 different singers, I might be able to extract some of the style. And the one that you just heard, Borghild Bryn Langgaard, she is a very popular star of recording at in that time. There's one here that you might have heard of before. This is Kirsten Flagstad. She has not yet reached her peak. She will sing at the Met from 1930 to 36 to 1950. 260 performances, I think, and she premiered Richard Strauss's Fjellets Lieder in 1950. But at this time, she's too young. But who are they? So I listened to these recordings and I thought, I don't really relate to these. They sound like old women to me, honestly. They sound like something that's not relevant for me as a performer today. And I started to try to learn more about them, to get them to know them. I collected pictures, I read about them. But they still seemed very strange and I don't know. I couldn't see myself as part of their group. Like, I had imagined I would feel like they're my friends, you know, this is my group. Although beautiful, but not really relatable. And they were still brave. I mean, this is a time where Norwegian women didn't even have the right to vote. But they were standing on stage dressed like this. So it was quite brave. And then I found these pictures. And I thought they look different. They could be someone I know. They could be an Instagram account, you know? And I thought, oh, maybe they are real women, or were, you know? They seem more real to me. So I thought, okay, they are obviously singing like this because they like it, because they think this is something that, this is a way for them to express themselves. And so I thought, I have to find out why they're singing like this. So I made a list of singers, and I printed out pictures of all of them. So the lower 2 rows are pictures of the singers recorded, and then the other rows are their musical genealogy. So this is who their teachers were. I thought maybe they were just taught in Norway, that it was a kind of local tradition. But it wasn't. I found Bach, and as an early music singer, I was very, very happy with that. Because he's not that far away, not that many generations, you know? And then I found others. So they all traveled to Paris, London, Berlin, Stockholm, and learned from singers who were really important. So I think I can say that they are part of a European cultural tradition. And there are some performers here also. You might know Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale. And here is Manuel Garcia and his two sisters, Maria Malibran and Pauline Viardot. So they are actually not just some Norwegians out in the wilderness by themselves, islands by themselves. So I would repeat again and again and again, short sections. This is just me doing what I used to do with folk music, but with classical recordings. And I found that if I tried to have fun, even if I didn't understand the words, I would just try to make up something, you know? And so it goes. So the question is, can I recreate this? Can I actually use this as part of my artistic expression? And I don't have any answers to that yet. I would like to say, like Nina yesterday, it's a no conclusion 2024. But I did have a little, I had a sense that maybe if I feel some kind of ownership to this music, it would be easier for me. Because folk music is also, like, it's old-fashioned, but still I feel like it's part of me when I sing it. So this is a picture of a map of Christiania, or Oslo, from 1901. This is the city where I grew up. And it's also the place where these performers lived. These are the theaters where they would work and where the operas were performed at that time. And the Norwegian Academy of Music, just for reference, so that you know where that is. So the blue dots are where these performers lived, and the pink dots are actually places where I have lived or gone to school. Or other, like my grandmother lived near the Academy of Music. So I thought if this were a folk tradition, it would definitely be my tradition. This would be in my drinking water. It would be in the air that I breathe. So maybe this could provide an excuse or a reason for me to sing like they do. So I'd like to end by singing one of these songs to you that I learned from this performer. I put her name on the top, and if you're interested in who composed it, you can look at the bottom. But I haven't looked at the score, so I wouldn't know.
Thank you so much. Is this on? You can hear me? It's so nice to hear live singing at an opera conference. So I'd like to welcome our next presenter, Ko-Hua. She is an ethnomusicologist PhD student at the University of California, Davis. She received her master's degree in musicology from National Taiwan University in 2018. Her manuscript, titled Sounding Taiwanese Identity, Lim Zhong Electronic Dance Music Album, Insects Awaken, was accepted by the International Musicological Society Conference as a free paper in 2017. Her research explores sound studies under the popular music context, which includes the research interests including the relationship between sound and identity, acoustic listening, and electronic dance music. Thank you, Ko-Hua. Let's welcome Ko-Hua.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm also excited to share with you about my research project. My research project is named Sounding Japanese in Opera, Sound Analysis in Madam and Butterfly. Because I'm not from the opera background, so I will approach the opera itself for decentering musicological attention and discourse from analysis of a music score to the noises in the soundtrack of a film, production of an opera, and how these noises can be as meaningful and as composed thoughtfully as the score. Sorry. Okay. So I was shifting attention from the music score to cinematic soundtrack in film opera. So what I try to analyze is the sound in the film opera genre, and what I focus on is the post-production sounds, that is sounds that did not appear in the opera score. And also I will try to exploring the meaningful relationship between sound and their visual reference. So here is several concepts that I will use from the sound studies. One of the important theory I will use is Michel Sion's 3 listening modes, including causal listening, semantic listening, and reduced listening. In this opera film opera genre, most of the sounds in the Madam Butterfly film belong to the causal listening. Causal listening is that people listening to sounds in order to trace the source of it. For example, when you heard a sound, you try to find the source of it. And most of them in the film belong to this category. And also the semantic listening means that people listening to a sound by understanding the content of the sound. For example, when you have a conversation with others, you try to understand the content or the language of the people. And also the reduced listening. This one is people want to focus on the quality of the sound. For example, in the electric dance music, people enjoy the sound quality in the music, but this kind of listening mode is hardly found in the opera film genre, specific in this film. And also I will apply Mary Schiffer's soundscape and schizophrenia. Schizophrenia means that when you recorded a sound by a machine, the sound will immediately separate into 2 individual sounds. One is the original one, and the other is the recorded one. Although the 2 sounds are similar to each other, but we have to consider it as 2 individual sounds. And also I will apply Brian Kent's sound models, including the source, cause, and effect. So here is my argument. I argue that sound in the film soundtrack serves 3 functions. The first is suggesting a Japanese soundscape, and the second one is performing an active force in plot development, and third one is reinforcing the emotional expression of characters. So here I try to Because I have time limitations, so I will only present one of my argument, that is sound in the opera, this Madame Butterfly opera film general. They building a Japanese soundscape. Here I categorize these sounds into 2 listening modes and 3 different relationship between the visual reference and the sounds. So like what I've mentioned before, like coastal listening is people listen to sound tracing the source, and the semantic listening is listening to like content or language of the sound. So the first situation, the relationship between the visual reference and the sound is that they appeared simultaneously. What I mean is when you see like people walking in the film, you immediately heard the sound when they are walking. So they appear simultaneously. And also, like we can see like there are many sounds like belong to this category. Like when you heard a bird sound, you saw a bird. So they are connected. And the second situation is that sound appeared before the visual reference. That means the sound will appear first. Then after a very short period, the visual reference appeared. So there is like delay of their appearance. And also the third situation is the sound appeared without visual reference. That means when you heard a sound, you didn't see the sources. For example, there are many sounds in the Madame Butterfly that is about the sound of insects, but we never see the real insects in the film. We just heard the sound. Yeah. So here I give an example of it. This is a sewing machine. So the sewing machine appear again with a visual reference. Okay, so here why I argue that this kind of like sound like disconnect with the visual reference help to build a Japanese soundscape is that when you like when the sound appeared first without the visual reference, that it notified the audience or informed the audience that there is a space and something happened here. So when the audience, they try to like get information from the visual reference that there is a Japanese house, there's like people with like Japanese dress walking around, they understand the social context of the sound. So this kind of like, what I mean is when you're trying to approach the sounds in this kind of production, a post-production film, you have to like considering the visual reference perspective, because you cannot just discuss the sound individually without considering their like special connections with a visual reference. Yeah. So thanks for your attention. Because of a time limitation, I can only present one example. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ko-Hua. That was wonderful. All right, so next up we have
John Matthew Cowan is a PhD student in musicology at Indiana University Bloomington, Jacobs School of Music. He holds a BA in music studies from the University of South Florida and an MM in musicology from the University of Miami. John's primary research interests include Austro-Germanic instrumental music and opera of the 18th century, U.S. American jazz music with attention to Sinatra, and all things musicological historiographical. His recently completed master's thesis explicates the historical and contemporary contexts of monostatos Black and Turkish identities in response to recent trends in productions of Die Zauberflöte. John has presented at the annual meeting of the American Society for 18th Century Studies, will have his work featured at the 2024 Mozart Colloquium, and had his thesis cited in the New Cambridge Companion to the Magic Flute as, quote, welcome new research that considers race in Mozart studies, end quote. So take it away, John.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Anushka, for organizing, and excuse me, thank you to Pierre for bringing us all here, and I know he's done so much for me and so much for many others, and I'm very grateful for his support in inviting me to speak today. So, what can be done with problematic opera characters like Monostatos in Die Zauberflöte? No single solution exists. There is no Monostatos theorem. Rather, by placing Monostatos in the cultural and political situations of 1791 Vienna, scholars can prompt a multiplicity of interpretations that directors and performers can tailor to their current cultural and political landscapes. For Monostatos, a blackamoor, there are two principal contexts, his blackness and his Turkishness. Though these identities are conflated, Schikaneder's texts and Mozart's music play distinct roles, as the libretto makes Monostatos black and Mozart's music makes him Turkish. On the one hand, Schikaneder's depiction of Monostatos as black is most certainly racist, and it arguably represents a step forward as a black-skinned character is portrayed as a human being capable of introspection. On the other hand, Mozart's music, in its turn to the stereotypes of Turkishness, complicates potential approaches as it does nothing to help redeem the character. The key to Monostatos lies in how his black and Turkish identities and characterizations manifest and interact, and such understandings beget many interpretations that it can effectively confront and engender reflection on the enduring realities of racial and ethnic bias. Schikaneder's depiction of Monostatos presents the European theatrical stereotypes of blackness, be it of skin or of color, that pejorative things of ugliness, evil, and folly. This is most apparent in his juxtaposition against the gentle and explicitly white Pamina, or in Zarastro's line, know that your heart is as black as your face. Schikaneder's racism is most evident in Monostatos' solo aria, Act 2, number 13, Alles für die Liebe Freuden, where, grappling with his self-loathing concerning his ugly black skin that he says, and his lustful desires, he prepares to assault the sleeping Pamina. Racist as this text is, it is arguably a progressive depiction of a black-skinned character for 1791 Vienna. Monostatos' self-awareness of his ugliness that Schikaneder prescribes to him and the other introspections that he presents reflect a shift in Enlightenment philosophy. Sender Gilman has documented that Enlightenment racial philosophy shifted from perception-based racism to cultural relativism in the mid to late 18th century, influenced by Kant and his theories that emphasize the observer's role in assigning implications to color. As a result, some librettists began to depict black-skinned characters as human beings, rather than as exotic creatures or manifestations of a color. Therefore, Schikaneder's racist depiction of Monostatos is demythologized and individualized. Does not Schikaneder remark, although in costume as Papageno, there are black birds in the world, why not black men as well? Though Monostatos is not the only violent, deceitful, or textually ugly character in the opera, he is the only one who is both lecherous and textually black. Thus, the bulk of Schikaneder's racism lies in his coding of Monostatos' lechery with blackness. This is complicated, however, by the often cut dialogue of the three slaves in Act 1, scenes 9 and 10. The slaves despise and among themselves rebuke Monostatos for his cruel and lecherous treatment of Pamina. The slaves, however, also refer to Monostatos as a Moor and the Black Monostatos. Therefore, we are left with ethno-racial ambiguity regarding the slaves. While in performance practice they were often put in blackface as monostatos, the libretto makes no mention of their race, ethnicity, or skin color, and I've yet to find any historical images of these characters. If these slaves were in fact dramaturgically black, as is monostatos, this does not clear Zauberflöte of any racism, nor is that my intention, nor should that be our goal. Rather, it strengthens the interpretation of monostatos as a character with a choice to surpass racial stereotype, especially since 3 other characters of his race criticize his behavior. This communicates indirectly to the audience that black persons are neither immutably lecherous nor evil, and therefore that perhaps monostatos chooses to be so. Given the didacticism of Zauberflöte, one can see Schikaneder's racism therefore as assimilationist. Sarastro tests monostatos with multiple opportunities to reform his actions, as he is immutably black in face, as Schikaneder makes him ugly, but not immutably black in soul or evil. By giving in to his self-serving lechery and deceit, monostatos makes himself as black as his soul, as black as his face. Therefore, by including other black characters in Zauberflöte, performers can complicate the racial symbolism and allow monostatos agency, notwithstanding monostatos' line in his aria, "Because a black man is ugly," is unequivocally racist and unaffected by the presence of other black characters, but more on this in my conclusion. Monostatos' Turkishness, meanwhile, manifests in Mozart's score and is all but lost on contemporary audiences, as the alla turca no longer leaps out of the musical texture as it did. While othering, the alla turca is not indelibly linked to blackness, and therefore one can assume for now that Mozart plays no role in orally identifying his race. In discourse on Zauberflöte and monostatos, discussion of his Turkishness lags behind that of his blackness. As is often the case, scholarship has focused more on Schikaneder's contributions than on Mozart's. Monostatos' Turkish portrayal was shaped by war, in particular the concurrent 1789-91 Austro-Turkish War, decades of cultural exchange and exoticization of the Ottoman Empire that culminated in the Austrian Turkery fad. Monostatos as a Moor is a transplant from the contemporaneously popular abduction genre. Similar characters like Osmin from Mozart's Entführung aus dem Serail, or the myriad of other vaguely Middle Eastern works and characters present on the stage at this time perpetuated the dangerous, comical, and generalized others of the Moor, the Ottoman, and or the Turk. As Mozart's use of the Turkish topic colors monostatos' every musical appearance, he is therefore anti-Ottoman propaganda, cartoonish, neurotic, unsophisticated, and barbaric. We need not look further than monostatos' first appearance, Act 1, Scene 11, der Terzerto, Du feines Täubchen ne herein, to see Mozart's employment of the Turkish topic's gamut, a forceful introduction, G major, duple meter, and a soaring flute that recalls the Turkish fife. As the number continues, certain accompanimental Turkish markers only occurred during monostatos' lines. Quip-like trill figures in the first violin and breakneck two-note tremolo in the viola reinforce the sonically other in monostatos, whereas Alberti patterns in the second violin and slower, less incessant bass lines underscore Pamina's pleading to center her in an orally familiar European context. Furthermore, monostatos has choppy phrases built on undecorated scales and arpeggios in contrast with Pamina's elegant lines complete with supplicatory appoggiatura. Whether in his own scene or in brief diversions and ensemble numbers, Mozart crafts monostatos decidedly as an orally Turkish other. Unlike Schikaneder, Mozart does nothing to potentially contribute towards a justified representation of monostatos, as this brand of alla turca is comic in all circumstances, as he once noted to his father in a letter while he was composing Die Entführung. Consider the one serious Ottoman character in Mozart's oeuvre, Pasha Selim of Die Entführung. He is conspicuously a spoken role, as the alla turca would have belittled him and rendered him comedic. In the text of monostatos' aria, Alles für die liebe Freuden, he does offer a keenly introspective and tragic soliloquy. Mozart, however, accompanies this number with his only use of the very Turkish piccolo, soaring over the centerpiece alla turca number of the Singspiel. Monostatos here functions as the stereotypical self-serving Ottoman harem keeper with a one-woman harem, Pamina. Therefore, his lechery is in fact tied both to his blackness and his Turkishness through Mozart's music. The anti-black racism of Schikaneder's libretto is, as a result of monostatos' conflated blackamoor identity, inseparable from the politically motivated anti-Turkish ethnicism of Mozart's music. This distinction between racial and ethnic attribution is useful in analysis, but is consequently not much help in performance, as a libretto or a score alone does not an opera make. Consequently, even if a production removes all markers of race from Monastos's text and costume, as is standard practice, prejudice is still present in his pejorative alla turca music that, in the case of his blackamoor identity, codes pejorative blackness as well. Creating awareness among the audience about Monastos's derogatory textual and musical representations, and of course the history of his blackface costuming, is essential. A pre-concert lecture or program note can achieve this, irrespective of the interpretation that is present in the performance. To paraphrase Lily Cass, attempting to remove these problematic elements is merely veiling them and consequently deceiving to the audience. One proposal of the many possible is to stage the opera complete with its original text, with the three slaves and Monastos all played by African-American or those who identify as black-skinned persons. As a result, Monastos has given agency, the racial coding is complicated, and opportunities are created for performers of color. If staged as such, I believe Monastos can cease to be risible and rather become pitiable, as an 18th century work need not be perceived with 18th century racial and ethnic sensibilities. Schikaneder's racist texts and Mozart's ethnicist music do mock Monastos, yes, but must the audience be complicit in that? Furthermore, while we are here to decenter opera, why not bring Monastos and his suffering to the center of Die Zauberflöte? Performers can thus facilitate a shift in the audience's perception of Monastos into a character of free will, yes, but one driven to evil by the stereotypes that this fictional world attaches to his race and ethnicity, let alone his and the other slaves' oppression under Sarastro. Rather than simply othering Monastos in some fashion, as has become common practice, this approach prompts engagement with the original facets of his character that made him a pejorative other. These facets still hold relevance to the cultural and political issues of the 21st century that pertain to the perception and treatment of black-skinned and or Middle Eastern North African persons by hegemonic white and European authorities. In this approach, the fictional world of Die Zauberflöte will then be perhaps a poignant reflection on the enduringly unequal reality in which it was created. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We have our next presenter, Ali. He is an Iranian-American opera scholar, violinist, and pianist. He studied at the Tehran University of Art, as well as UC Berkeley, where he studied with Professor James Davies. He earned his bachelor's degree from Berkeley in 2022 with a thesis on the history of opera in Iran before the Islamic Revolution. He is currently a PhD student working with Pier Paolo here at Davis. And in addition to his historical scholarly studies on late classical and early romantic music, Ali has been a chamber violinist and pianist since 2016. Please welcome Ali.
Thank you. Okay. So my project today is called Albert Lortzing's Regina, the German liberation Freiheitsoper. In year 1848, there was a turning point in Europe's politics. Karl Marx published his Manifesto of the Communist Party, and the series of working-class revolutions broke throughout Europe by March of this year, starting in France, soon spreading to Germany and Austria. Fueled by Marx's manifesto, these revolutions occurred to balance the power between the proletariat and the monarchy. Inspired by the revolutionary movements, the German composer Albert Lortzing, praised for his popular comic operas and writing his own liberty, decided to compose his most political work. Therefore, the opera Regina was born with a synopsis that narrates the tale of a liberation. Richard, a factory frontman, liberates his fiancée and factory owner's daughter, Regina, who is kidnapped by her other lunatic lover, Stefan. However, as we shall observe, Lortzing fails to pave a smooth pathway to the liberation section of the story. Regina's libretto reveals Lortzing's ambivalence on whether he supports the idea of revolution or sanctifies the monarchy. In my research, I argue that along with the reasons offered by the limited modern Lortzing scholarship for the prevention of staging Regina during Lortzing's time, such as bad timing of its completion, his political instability also proved fatal to the success of this opera. At the beginning of 1848, Lortzing supported many of the Viennese revolutionaries on the front lines who were killed for their rights. However, after observing the successes of the Viennese revolutionaries, such as resignation of notorious Count Metternich in March, and the downfall of Emperor Ferdinand I in May, he believed that whatever the revolutionaries were doing thereupon was merely redundant aggression and anarchy that could be replaced by respectful and calm requests. Soon, this became Lortzing's utopian but peculiar ideology of any resistance movement. As a result, he stopped siding with the revolutionaries, and my research shows that this was the starting point of the inconsistency in Regina's synopsis, since it turned the libretto into a dichotomic potpourri of unresolved resistance movement and abrupt heroic liberation story. Furthermore, Regina's music shows Lortzing's ambivalence from the beginning of the overture. The three-part overture in C major gets decentralized from the home key right after three first notes and instead lands on a dominant key of G, which is quite surprising, especially because we don't hear any preparation in the home key for this dominant motif that sounds like a second theme itself. Furthermore, the tonality abruptness in the overture, the brilliant orchestration, and the pale vocal lines of the arias of this opera are pretty paradoxical themselves. The first act starts with a chorus of workers striking in the factory. The scene clearly delivers the workers' anger due to the unfairness of their low income. However, soon Richard, who has sided with the factory owner to win her daughter's hand in marriage, arrives and blames them for their ingratitude. As a result, workers calm down instantly and become ashamed of what they demanded before. Despite their strong entrance and righteous demands in the first act, the story gets derailed and the focus shifts from them toward the factory owner's family. The workers get even more disempowered when the factory, their only source of income, is set on fire during Regina's abduction at the end of first act. And after that, nobody hears anything else about them in the remaining acts. Lortzing wanted to teach his audience as a lesson and closes the strikers' case since they were not aligned with his political ideology of demanding everything with calmness. And this ideology is advertised throughout the whole opera by Richard's character in many instances. It looks like Lortzing was so obsessed with his political opinion that he could not question himself, why did revolutions exist throughout history if everything was achievable by calmness? In his letter of August 26th of 1848, he mocks Wagner for supporting the resistance and being ungrateful for the positions monarchy provided him with. This letter proves that he lacked the understanding of any revolutionary commitment. Lortzing never admitted siding with the authorities. However, the textual characterization of Regina suggests that he metaphorically did that. At first, Richard and the factory owners are portrayed as symbolic authorities who seek their benefits and credibility in silencing workers' strike, which makes them the antagonists of the first act. While in Acts 2 and 3, they are sanctified as brave protagonists who risk their lives to liberate Regina. Regardless of maturity of its orchestration, Regina remained in shadows until a century after its composition, and even Lortzing's publisher rejected it. It sealed Lortzing's professional destiny as a composer and resulted in cold reception of his two following works. The inner conflicts and the shakiness of Lortzing's personality regarding the sensitive subject of revolution were critical reasons for Regina's failure. But studying this unusual opera at the present moment is an important step in examining the any other liberation opera also, and their characterization, their roles as political vehicles of resistance. Thank you.
So next up, we have Mariana de Silva Gabriel. She is a musicology PhD student at the University of California, Davis. Originally from Portugal, Mariana moved to the United Kingdom at the age of 6. She received her bachelor's degree from Cardiff University and her master's from the University of Oxford. Her research interests are in the interplay between music and politics under authoritarian regimes and music making as a societal response to those regimes. So next up, we'll have Mariana.
Hello. Thank you. Thanks so much to Sarah, Anushka, and Pierre for inviting me. So I'll just get started. I'll try to remember to breathe. On February 23, 2022, the Metropolitan Opera House announced its new season. The next day, the news broke out that Russia had commenced its invasion of Ukraine, the largest attack on a European country since World War II. 7 months later, an audience gathered at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, awaiting the premiere of Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk. Despite the revival of Lady Macbeth not being at the forefront of the initial promotional material, it soon became the most politically charged production of their 2022 to 2023 roster. The symbolism of performing an opera that was censored by Stalin back in the 1930s, juxtaposed with the reality of Russians being once again silenced by Putin, is the crux of my research. A little overall a methodology of how I go about this research. Through the lens of musical resistance, my main purpose is to offer a reception study on Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth and illustrate how the opera has evolved into a symbol of protest that transcends its original boundaries. In order to do this, I contextualize Shostakovich and Lady Macbeth in its original historical and political context. The story of Dmitri Shostakovich is one that is widely known, often muddled with this historical and political chaos, and it's in this muddledness that sparked my interest. It is widely regarded, albeit controversial, that Shostakovich's subversive musical writing began after a series of events. This includes Stalin's attendance of the performance of Lady Macbeth in 1936, the consequential chaos/muddle instead of music Pravda article, and then his public denunciation. In my research, I uncover moments of musical resistance already present within this opera, such as his rewriting of the main character, Katerina Izmailova, to showcase that the opera's subversive potency and to highlight its non-conformity with Soviet Union ideology, which then caused it to become censored. Considering the historical and political context of Lady Macbeth, I examine how the opera can be repurposed as a symbol of resistance and recontextualized in the Met's 2022 revival, emphasizing the concept that resistance can be transferable and decentered to resist against different entities. In the interest of time, I will primarily focus on the Met's revival. While it is true that the Met's performances are chosen and planned long in advance, this revival and its connection to the Russian-Ukrainian war certainly has an element of serendipity. The significant and timely connection was not lost on anyone, particularly the conductor of the Met revival, Kerry Lynn Wilson, who is of Ukrainian descent. In the aftermath of Putin's invasion, Wilson, which can be seen in the top left, has played a key role in the political undercurrents of the opera's revival by establishing the Ukraine Freedom Orchestra, which launched a worldwide tour performing symbolic repertoire. The Met also took a firm stance in the wake of Russian invasion by cutting ties with several renowned Russian musicians who refused to denounce Putin's actions. Peter Gleb, the general manager of the Met, expressed solidarity with the people of Ukraine and stated that Met would help ring the alarm and contribute to the fight against oppression. Although this revival of Lady Macbeth was already in the works, Given the Met's strong political stance and Wilson's active use of music as protest, one could suggest that Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth would be the perfect piece of musical weaponry to protest Putin. And this is exactly how the opera was perceived and received. In interviews leading up to the performance, Wilson highlighted the symbolism of reviving this opera in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, referencing the opera's censorship in 1936 and connecting it to its history of what was and is still happening in Russia today. And what's particularly striking is that these parallels can be seen in the official program of the Met. Therefore, even before the opera revival was commencing, or even during the performance, audience members were already reflecting on the connection between the opera's history and the current affair in Ukraine. Indeed, the decision to present and assert the symbolism of reviving Shostakovich's opera for the audience becomes an overt act of resistance. This is then exemplified by the reception that the revival received, with many pointing out the connections and the recontextualization of the opera as a form of protest towards Putin's actions against Ukraine. Given Wilson's activism, the Met's action, and the resistance-filled reception of the opera, Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth can be and has been seen as a potent form and method of protesting the ongoing war in Ukraine. This further highlights the symbolic and transcendent nature of Shostakovich's opera and its ability to serve as a musical protest in a multitude of contexts beyond its original setting. Much like the context of the opera, the mode of resistance that carries it can likewise transform, decenter, and recenter with time and changing events. Thank you.
So we have our last speaker for today for the panel. Max Jefferson is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. Centering her research around the agency and reception of Black bodies and voices in American art music of the 20th and 21st centuries, her current dissertational work studies Black nationalist music of the 1960s, considering the historical and theoretical construction of Black aesthetic space. Previously, in her master's thesis, American Pseudo-Realism, the Subversion of Black Agency in George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, she interrogated the 1935 opening productions of Gershwin's Porgy and Bess not as musical art, but as propaganda. As a singer, Jefferson built an 18-year career in operatic and choral performance. This experience, while rich in artistic fulfillment, in part inspired Jefferson to question the traditional lot of people of color, such as herself, in such circumstances, and further to work for a more equitable future in scholarship, performance, and education. So let's welcome Max.
Goodness. Well, I'd like to join in the thanks of, the invitation and welcome and gracious answering of many emails that made it possible for me to be here today. But I will get the ball rolling. Improvisation is a method and an ethics, both in music and in opening up a path philosophically. Improvisation, that is, in the terms of the Black radical tradition, rather than that of the European avant-garde. Improvisation is a matter of informality. Informality is not a failure to be formal, but a decision as to how to talk, think, and be, how to relate and offer and accept relation, end quote. I don't presume to participate in generic prescription, within or upon opera studies. Rather, this is an exploration of what might be observed in the continued proliferation of Black opera. For today's purposes, I hope to provide some insight into a Black tradition that I have detected in the production of new opera. My analysis today is based on my research for my dissertation provisionally entitled Black Sonic Worlding, Black Nationalist Music and Criticism, 1965 through 1969. My project limits its purview exclusively to the United States and to the cultural formation of Black nationalism that began in New York City with the collective move to Harlem in 1965. My aim is to begin to recover both the distinct Black music criticism specific to this cultural formation and its co-constitutive Black musical practice, parsing what I call Black nationalist music from the broader generic classification of experimental jazz, into which scholarly discourse has allowed it to be subsumed. Following the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, Amiri Baraka, a founding leader of the cohort of Black nationalist music, broke ties with the musical community of downtown New York City and moved uptown to open the Black Arts Repertory Theater School of Harlem. With this move, the otherwise itinerant network of Black nationalist music came together to construct what would become the aesthetic of what Baraka referred to as a deeply spiritual formation. Baraka wrote about the Black Arts Repertory Theater School, or BARTS, as, quote, the flare sent up that marked the explosion of Black arts institutions across the country, end quote. According to Baraka, the artistic goals of BARTS was to create a Black art that was, one, Black in composition, form, and content, quote, as Black as Billie Holiday or Duke Ellington, end quote. Two, mass-oriented and identifiable as part of a cultural revolution. And three, itself revolutionary, or as he put it, as revolutionary as Malcolm X. Baraka called the members of BARTS politically revolutionary and artistically powerful, both artists and militants. Music critic Greg Tate criticized in retrospect the separatist Black Übermensch campaign of these Black nationalists as ultimately politically ineffective. But he also credited them with the production of a Black cultural tradition, quote, every bit as deaf as classical Western civilization, every bit as valid, every bit as good. A cultural tradition that he argued, quote unquote, freed up the potential of Black creativity for pursuant generations. Black nationalist music was a musical practice and a speculative art committed to the construction of Black sound. It is improvisatory self-actualization through music made by Black practitioners in an exclusively Black space. It is an ideology made material through music, an imaginary world made real, a Black world theorized by Kevin Quaishi in 2021 as a Black world where Blackness is totality, where every human question and possibility is of people who are Black. Such a world might not exist in modernity, though it radiates in the will to make a poem, an essay, a song. It radiates in the text's imaginary as a philosophical audacity, as embracing generative quality of indisputable aliveness, end quote. Black nationalist music afforded agency to its practitioners over their own expression. In their music practice, they became insiders to the sound they constructed rather than untethered outsiders to the mainstream music industry. It feels odd to pose the proverbial "in this paper I will" at an event such as this one, where we've already spent a fabulous day and now morning exploring together the generative possibilities of opera. Opera now, opera moving forward. So I'll say this, there is no singular way, and I cannot possibly scare quote this enough, to express Blackness correctly. There are as many correct ways to be Black as there are Black people, past, present, and future. So I'm not proposing some new prescriptive definition for Black opera. But there is a tradition here, as brought to life by the Black nationalist cohort I have described. It is a tradition of sonic Black world building, of positive, generative Black expression. And I would like to share with you my observation of this tradition in opera as an exciting premonition of the potential of this genre that we obviously all quite love. Specifically, I would like to consider Wayne Shorter and Esperanza Spalding's 2021 opera Iphigenia, an opera of Black speculative art that prioritizes unconventional improvisation as both a compositional strategy and a narrative trope. It is an opera that asks us a question: what if? In Iphigenia, Shorter and Spalding's first what if asks what might happen if Iphigenia, when asked to sacrifice herself on the altar of the patriarchy, said no. But the question goes further. What if we allow tradition to be mutable, not gone, not done away with, but transparent and expansive? What if we allow opera to be more than it ever has been? I do wish I had the time to go through the plot of the opera point for point, the changes to Euripides' original tragic myth, the fourth wall rupturing appointment of the goddess Artemis as narrator, the juxtaposition of the pit orchestra and staged rhythm section as speculative instigation. But for the sake of honoring my 10 minutes, I will adhere to one lane: boxes. The boxes in which outsiders have attempted to punitively confine Iphigenia, the boxes that Iphigenia rejects. Esperanza Spalding co-founded the production company Real Magic with executive creative producer Jeff Tang of the Met Opera and National Sawdust for the purposes of realizing Wayne Shorter's dream of writing an opera. The founding of Real Magic, specifically for the production of Iphigenia, worked to break with the concept of tradition as limitation. For the artists, self-production was really the only way to proceed if their opera was going to get beyond the prescriptive generic boundaries that overdetermine existing structures of North American theatrical practice today. Iphigenia is not a jazz opera by a jazz composer, or even an opera injected with some jazz. Neither is it a crossover production with expectations of one commercial generic classification being put upon another. It is something else entirely. Joining opera singers and members of Shorter's long-standing jazz quartet with a 28-piece orchestra. The idea of Real Magic was to foster, quote, an environment of radical experimentation and open collaboration, free from commercial expectations, end quote. It existed for Shorter's dream and the promise of the what if. Shorter did not write a jazz opera, he wrote an opera. Philip Golub, Iphigenia's musical dramaturg, explains, quote, if people think the opera sounds like jazz, it's just because all modern jazz sounds like Wayne, end quote. Iphigenia cannot and should not be confined to some generic essence. The extraction and abstraction of essence, feminine essence, Black essence, is a through line of the opera's plot. Genre here is a trap because it serves archetypal thinking by capitalizing on the desire for essence. Is Iphigenia heard as a jazz opera because of the inclusion of improvisation? Or perhaps because there's a rhythm section on stage? Or perhaps because of the work and reputation of its composer? The issue is that each of these questions yearns for the security of an essentializing system of generic classification that ignores the methods and goals that Shorter and Spalding bring to life in Iphigenia. These questions beg for a conclusion, a band-aid, a fix. Again, I do wish I had time today to walk you through the plot and execution of Iphigenia. I will quickly and shamelessly plug my Opera Quarterly review of the opera, just in case you'd like to read more about what Shorter and Spalding have brought to life. But I will share one important and frankly beautiful aspect of this opera. There's no conclusion, there's no answer, not one we're privy to. Iphigenia turns her back to the audience, walking off stage in the embrace of her sisters, sounding with them an improvisatory call and response. The conclusion of the Iphigenia on stage is private. It's for her. It is not her burden to grant us a fix. It's our job to pick up her question, what if? My final few minutes, that is, I originally planned to use to synthesize the work of Black scholars Fred Moten, Nathaniel Mackey, and James Sneed, in which they consider extemporaneous musical expression as the manifestation of Black potential. Each of their theorizations, versioning, the cut, which I'd be thrilled to talk about when there isn't a clock running out. Let's see. Posits music. Their theorizations posit music as action and Blackness as a continuous process. Moten, Mackey, and Sneed interrogate a space, an imaginary space, a physical space, a sonic space, in which Blackness exists in a simultaneity of experience. One experience exists in the conditions prescribed onto Black people by outside forces, and the other exists in the realization that in the philosophical nothingness to which Blackness has long been sequestered, there's a space set up purposefully outside of the oppressive construct, a place of possibility. But I will address one last thing. What is the variability in my title? Variability is potential, it's options, it's connectivity without enforced sameness. Michael Boone posits the universality for musical connectivity, not that it's some universal language or objective common tongue, but rather a connection based on sonic possibility. Sound is the consideration, is the raw material to which we all have access. He calls this wealth of raw material a, quote, musical continuum, a partless, undifferentiated whole, end quote. Take, for example, the space of an octave with its potentially infinite and infinitesimal differences between pitch. Variability is the multiplicity of metrics through which this sonic space might be considered and understood. Music is a process by which the continuum is accessed. Music is activity that begets discourse. Music is not a static object with finite definition. For Boone, the continuum is our circumstance, and music is the action through which we parse that circumstance. The connection I see between the tradition built by the cohort of Black nationalist music in the 1960s and Iphigenia in 2021 is an embracing of finding new ways to parse our circumstance as imperative. I made my switch in my primary research area from Black opera studies to the Black nationalist music I described when I realized that living in the Black history of the 1920s and 1930s, which seemed like the direction that I was going in, was not going to be emotionally sustainable for me. I left with a goal to find a musical practice in which the narrative pen of history is held by a Black hand. I'd grown tired of people telling us what we're supposed to be. So my delight upon experiencing Shorter and Spalding's Iphigenia, an opera of all things that allowed just that, Black storytelling, Black history making, my delight had a depth to which I haven't quite found the words yet. I can say it gave me hope for an opera studies that would not always be a struggle for agency, the agency of my subjects, for myself. I'm not saying that every opera needs to embrace improvisation or anything to that effect. I am saying we've grown, and opera has to grow with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. That was fantastic. I'm so glad that we got to have you and all of the scholars from outside UC Davis. That was beautiful. So now we're going to ask all of the panelists to come and sit up at our chairs on stage. I will be near the stage, so I can pass the mic to anyone. Anushka will be walking around with a mic, so you may address questions to anyone, or just us as a group in general. This is a casual panel. If you need to stand up, stretch, go to the bathroom, feel free to. We will be pushing the coffee break a little bit, but don't worry, you will get your coffee, I promise. I just want to make time for this conversation. So feel free to go outside and get water or a snacky at any point.
Looks like you're settled in seats. Cool. Yeah, I'd like to open up to questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It's really exciting to see the kind of work that all of you are doing and sort of where opera studies can go, or where I think a lot of us hope it will go. So thank you for that. My question is, well, what does opera offer us in these new directions that we can't find elsewhere? Why opera? And I think this is a question that a lot of us opera scholars get all the time, and so it's something to think about. But my question for you is, what is it that opera is allowing you to do as scholars that is different, that is special, that only opera can open up these particular questions for you? And I sort of leave this to anyone who wants to take that up.
Get this together for sure. Honestly, my answer is the fact that we love this thing, but that love's not unconditional. So it allows us to explore that thing that we love. It allows us to use it as a window through which to look and see what we could find, whether that's about ourselves, society, our field, etc. But I think that just because we do love the thing doesn't mean that it's a free reign situation where we have to love every part of it. We question the things that we love, right, in order for that relationship to grow.
For me personally, in my line of research area and interest, I think it's just so powerful. I think it's so entrenched in tradition and culture. There's a multitude of different operas and that mean different things. So it just really showcases to me how powerful it can be, you know, in the context of me, that it was, you know, powerful enough to protest something completely not related to opera.
So again, this is both a mixture of my personal opinion and I think what actually opera does, which I think, as Mariana said, it's a great vehicle of delivering messages. It can be like a political message, an emotional message, or whatever. And you know, since it's a mixture of multiple art forms in itself. Like it has staging, it has custom design, it has music. It's a, I would call it like a divine combination of all of these, which can express whatever, not necessarily the composer, but also the message of the context in which it's composed in pretty clearly. So I think that's what makes it separate from other art genres, I would say. Yeah.
My response will kind of echo some of the themes going on up here of just that we can all take it and get different meanings out of it. We can put old wine in new bottles, and we can, or new wine in old bottles, and we can get different readings, get different meanings, and tell different stories through this medium that often gives voices to, and puts us in the positions to care about these characters, to care about them, and put a story in front of us, and kind of allow us, so just when you're talking with Omar, when the ensemble comes out and brings us into this telling, into this narrative, it really envelops us in this experience. And as we start to map on our own readings and our own interpretations, or different productions taking their different spins on it and recontextualizing it, it allows us just to connect on a very deep and intimate level, both aurally, visually, sonically, however you take that. We can all get something out of this medium. And the question is how you spin it and how you read it.
I am like, because I'm not from like opera background, so doing this kind of like opera analysis, doing like approaching the opera by the sound methodology is quite very inspiring for me, because when I like trying to approach the like opera film like this genre, I began to think how audiences approach the sound differently between the opera and the live performances, and also a live opera as a film, like they approaching them in a very different way. And I started to think about how like audiences differentiate this kind of like sound in the film, how they define it, how they try to like frame this kind of different sounds. So I think this kind of opera film genre is quite a very inspiring one for me.
Maybe we can take another question.
Thanks for this incredibly brilliant and inspiring panel. All of you explored identity in these really interesting ways, with Sarah talking about the hunchback as a kind of fluid figure. Max talked about how there's no singular way to be Black. Sam discussed Hannah's evolving journey. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this productive tension between celebrating marginalized identities, but also acknowledging the fluidity and flexibility of our embodied identities.
Hey, I guess I'm being called to talk. That's complicated, is the center of it, but I think that's what we want to do with opera studies analysis, is open up the complexity of it. I think it's very easy to write about and very easy to teach, simple statements of, this is what disability looks like. This is what accessibility is, but it's not simple. And I think opera does open up those possibilities. The collaborative possibilities are a big part of that, of the different art forms coming together. And I think that's what the messiness is what I hope opera studies will tackle more. It is not easy to write about the messiness. It is not easy to talk about the messiness. And personally, I am trying to bring in more autoethnography from my personal experiences as a disabled person. I am writing about issues that I directly interact with my chronic illnesses of back pain, deformity, so-called deformity, and mental illness, or, you know, mental health things. So I am bringing my own stance into it without trying to make blanket statements of this is what all disabled people's lives are like, right? Yeah, and also I just hope to see more collaboration in this field, in writing, in discussing ideas and publication. I think that's a big part of what we can be missing when we try to tease out the nuances of these things, because I am coming at this from my disabled experience, but I know that I'm just one person, and the discussion is where I come to understand the disabled community or communities as in more broadly. Yeah, I hope that answers that kind of facet of it. Would someone else care to take it?
When Fire Shut Up in My Bones premiered, in an interview, Terrence Blanchard said, I don't want to be a token, I want to be a turnkey. So not treating new opera as if we're checking off boxes, I think is a good place to start. Not saying that that is what we're doing here today, but it is something that tends to happen. Like, oh, look, we've been diverse. Also, I do my best to listen to my subjects and take them at their word, and strike that balance that we all need to of doing that thing, of listening to your subjects, but also maintaining your scholarly critical distance, which is an eternal process, right? I mean, that's what I come up against a lot in doing work with Black nationalist music, because I'm not writing a checklist of how to be a Black nationalist. I am saying that this is a cultural movement that happened. There's a culture here. There's a musical tradition here. What was it, and how can we track that thing? Was it in a vacuum of a moment, which I don't think anything exists as, or is it something that can help us learn about music in ways we wouldn't have thought to before?
I actually would like to respond to Max. You kind of opened up a thing in disability studies in my head of responding to the text. So I study, you know, mostly 18th century music, but this being, like, understanding accessibility and disability as multiplicity, as variability, which is also discussed in disability studies, is a lot about understanding my own identity, but also bringing it into the classroom and bringing it into how I work with my materials. So even though I'm working with historic materials, I'm thinking about how that informs what I teach in the future, what my students will understand about what is opera, what did opera in the 18th century look like, and how is that forming and reforming our society today. So I think that's really important, even in historical contexts. Where is Anushka? Would you like to respond to that? I mean, I think your work does the same.
Yeah, as both of you were speaking, I will move so that no one's having to crane their neck. When I first started looking at opera in South Asia, it was very easy for me to start thinking in binaries of these are the British colonizers, these are South Asians that are colonized. But as I've been working through the history of South Asia, history of musical drama in South Asia, I've been finding that there's a lot of blurred lines. There's a spectrum between experiences. There are many experiences of coloniality. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to explore through my project, is that there was no one way in which South Asia was colonized. There was no one way in which colonial rule was experienced, depending on different positionalities within South Asian society. So that's kind of what I was thinking of, as it speaks to kind of the plurality of history. Any questions from?
There we go. Thank you all so much for your comments. And I think this is a really hard task. I'm sort of looking around the room to engage in a conversation because I think we want to ask each of you individual questions. I know I do. And so, but it's hard to. And so thanks for leading us off with a really good opening question. I guess I'll do two things. One, I want to say, to reiterate, this is really exciting work. And what you're doing, I think, to me, marks a sort of decentering or recentering different directions in opera studies, rather than only trying to open up what the first performance was like and how we got the performance, and who these composers were and what they were doing, and sort of the compositional genesis, and then what could an analysis look like, especially if you're dealing with tonal music or with form. You know, these are all really important things. And maybe, I don't know if I dare to say, sort of an early generation of putting opera studies very seriously in musicology, which is really what was happening in the 80s and the 90s. You guys are asking questions that ask to me, what does opera mean when it's performed today by bodies today? And how about those spaces which we didn't have time or weren't in the purview of colonial opera? That opera was happening in lots of places around the planet where you've got people who were the interaction between a European opera tradition in India. And what does it mean when you've got Hindustani music happening? I mean, it's just everything. I've taken all these notes because I'm so excited about this. So it seems like a big general thing is making opera relevant, or I'm trying to find clever ways to put centering, decentering, marginal, relevancy, embodiment today. But it seems like the type of opera, that opera is still, you're asking questions, and they're just new questions, additional questions. It's all really exciting. I got to see As One, and Laura Kaminsky was there, and it was, so I feel we could have a conversation. Lortzing, yeah, I mean, absolutely, Lortzing. I mean, what happens between Weber and Wagner, and, besides Marschner and Lindpaintner and those odd vampire operas? Like here we've got Factory Workers before Carmen. This is great and exciting. And I'm really, Carrie Lynn Wilson, I had to look this up on my phone because I was remembering she's not only an incredible conductor and a Ukraine national, but she's also married to Peter Gelb. And so there's sort of an interesting layer of who gets to sort of help lead and why the Met took such a strong reaction against Russia. I don't think it was only Gelb on his own, but it was sort of his lived experience with people. That Butterfly film was one of my very favorites, even though it was a very guilty pleasure, because I really wanted it after the first act. Yes, they really are going to fall in love. They're so beautiful, these people and the music. But what your stuff is doing is helping me listen to opera in a different way. What can a Japanese room sound like in a film? Wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So yeah, we have opera on screen and opera film studies, but you're bringing in new methodologies, I think, that can help us sort of decode it in different ways, ask new questions with sound studies. So don't feel like you don't belong in opera studies. You totally do, and welcome. It's a fun, Operaland is fun, or at least that's what I want to say. And Max, Iphigenie, ironically enough, I was in Pittsburgh last week, and I got to see Pittsburgh Opera do the Gluck, Iphigenie in Taraid. And so it was really funny, like, oh yeah, I'd heard about the Wayne Shorter and Esperanza Spalding, didn't know anything about it, sadly heard negative things, that it was kind of this indulgent project, but I'm so glad you're able to find sort of a context, it sounds like, to read it, and I'm gonna look up your opera quarterly review. And then, oh my gosh, I'm so bad with names. John, thanks. John, we should talk afterwards because I'm really interested in what you're doing with Monastistos. It's complicated, and I know this is still beginning work. It's complicated for you to say that maybe part of Monastistos' salvation is in being pitiable. That's hard to hear. And I think maybe there's a different compassion or element to center his experience as an outsider. But I'm interested in what you're doing, and I know you're working with Dan Malamed, who doesn't deal with these things enough, and so maybe you can help him. I probably shouldn't say stuff like that. But I mean, I don't want to be, speaking for all the Black people in the room, and I know Imani is around and she always has interesting things to say, or anybody else. But this is a hard topic that you're dealing with. And to evoke pity for him, along with the lecherousness and, this is complicated terrain. And one thing that just made me think, what he's doing in that opera, you've got the armed guards singing this really old-fashioned Bach-style chorale. Could it be that flute, not that he knew this was, he was so young, but right at the end of his life, he's at this point where he's introduced to, the Baron von Swieten is showing him all this Bach, and this is something Dan will love with all his Bach scholarship. Maybe he's putting in different voices in here. So you've got sort of an old learned style with the armed guards, and then you've got Monastasos with the Turkish elements, and then the Queen of the Night with all that excess. I don't know, different ways possibly. I'm happy to speak with all of you. And then Ingeborg, what a pleasure to hear about opera singing through a folk style of listening, and you're listening for impossible things, and yet you're doing it. And I really want to hear more about it. So thank you all so much. I don't mean to be sort of the hog with the mic, but I feel so connected, like each of these projects, I feel like, oh wait, I know something about this. Thank you so much. I think opera studies is really healthy now.
Thank you. We have time for some more questions.
Dare I stand at the back and risk neck injury? Is that okay? Can I just reiterate what the speakers have been saying so far about how exciting this is? I'm really impressed individually with what you're doing, but I'm also heartened at what it suggests for this sub-discipline. Is it even a sub-discipline that I love? I love opera like you guys, but I also love opera studies, but I want it to thrive. And I think it is going to, if this is an indication of some of the direction it might take. Can I ask a general question and one individual question? And maybe I'll put out the general question first, and maybe you can think about that, and then I'll ask an individual question. The general question has to do with something that I think actually, Sarah, you mentioned this, which is collaboration in scholarship. Because we've talked about opera as this collaborative model. Collaboration in scholarship, actually in the humanities, is not well catered for. You can organize brilliant events like this to facilitate dialogue, but the projects that you undertake, you're supposed to, thanks to the institutions that grant the degrees, they're supposed to be individual. You may collaborate within that, but it's your name on the parchment. So there's still this model, and journals like the one I'm involved with, Opera Quarterly, still largely feature single-authored work. What would you like to see? What kind of models can you imagine for collaboration as scholars, and who would you be collaborating with? That's the general question. If you could maybe reflect on that. My individual questions for Inge, which is, I'm really interested in noise and how you're having to deal with the question of noise. You're in a way filtering out a voice, something singable, from this sometimes noisy soundscape. Does noise feature only as a negative that needs to be filtered out, or does it somehow come back into the song, the sung part of what you're studying?
Well, I'll try to answer that. I think I'll start with an anecdote from my father. He was in the Navy and he worked as a radio operator. And I remember from when I was a child, he told me that, yeah, the first 3 weeks I couldn't hear anything in the radio. It was just like, and then it was like a light was turned on and I could hear everything. I had almost the same experience when I studied in Germany and getting off the train in Cologne at the train station, and there was this noise of announcing all the trains where they arrived, and so much noise, and I couldn't understand, and then I had the same experience. So I kind of knew that this was something I could expect, that after a while I wouldn't hear the noise. And it has happened. I don't really notice the noise. And I think this is also, I mean, the people who had bought records at that time, they would also hear the noise, but they wouldn't hear it, you know? It was the limitation of the medium. But I think for me today, the noise also gives a kind of nostalgia that anyone that would hear an old recording, they would hear the whoosh in the beginning, and they recognize it as something that represents the past and probably has some kind of nice old-fashioned memories connected to it. Many people have asked me to use AI or, you know, to get rid of, to enhance the sound quality. And I thought that would be interesting, but it would be a totally different project because I'm not going to present perfect recordings. I'm going to present my own version of these songs. So when I suddenly didn't notice the noise anymore, and I really did try to connect with a kind of empathy to the persons I was listening to. I looked at the pictures, I tried to imagine how they were feeling, and I also relied on the response in my body, which I also recognized from talking to a loved one on the phone with a bad connection. And I could still, you know, you can pick up these little signs of how they're doing, how they're feeling, how their emotional state is, and you can feel it in your own body. So this is how I would try to reflect whatever they were doing in my body. Yeah.
Well, that's an answer.
So now we'll take the second part of the question, and if whoever would like to respond, and then unfortunately that will have to be our last question so we can get the coffee break.
I apologize because I'm going to haphazardly tackle this question of bringing in collaboration. And I've always thought it's very interesting that musicians are the primary force talking about opera, because there's so many more components to an opera than just the music, right? Bringing in the libretto and bringing in someone that specializes in English to talk about the text. We've got costuming, we've got staging, we've got architecture and design. It's such like an interdisciplinary display. And it's often just kind of relegated to just musicians. So in the idea of collaboration, I've always had this pipe dream of having this conversation of all the components and bringing in these voices to talk about all these different aspects of opera. And especially in all the conversations we've had over this weekend, and we're going to continue to have as we all work in decentering opera, of even the deeper connections besides the surface level of the text and of the architecture and the staging and the dancing, of what other representations can we bring into the classroom, can we bring into the conversation to enlighten us, to provide different opinions, different insights, and continue on this conversation. All these is just this perpetual conversation of how we can continue to talk and continue to get closer. I think Nina's comment on the year of no conclusions is such a great one that we need to continue having these conversations, and we might never reach a conclusion, and that's okay. But it's constantly trying to get there, trying to get a little closer. And I think bringing people in and collaborating and drawing from different fields and different ideas and different backgrounds is a great way to how to get there.
This is really a continuation of that. Seeing the value in starting or joining conversation and not attempting to end it. I tend to call what I do yelling at various volumes, but it's not for lack of care for this thing that we're a part of. I quite enjoy being a part of academia for a lot of reasons. But one thing that I value the most is its discursive nature. And while our names are the one that are on the page of whatever we happen to be writing, if we're not interacting with others in any capacity of connection to whatever the subject or subject matter that we're dealing with, then I don't think that we've fully engaged with the work we're trying to do.
I feel a bit like the odd one out here, not being a musicologist until recently posing as one. But I'm just really grateful to be included in this community. And I think that for me, it would be fantastic to be able to collaborate with more musicologists, seeing a different perspective on basically the same material. I'm a little sorry to admit this, but I don't love opera. I have been trying to avoid singing in operas through my career. And this is because I see opera as a workplace that is not very, well, I wouldn't say hostile, but it's not a very pleasant place for a singer to be a lot of the time. So I think this perspective that I humbly can offer can also be something I would be really interested in hearing from another perspective. And I think also when we talk about decentering opera, this is the question that I'm often left with, but what about the opera singers and what's going on within the opera? As a singer, you're standing on stage, everyone is telling you what to do, what to wear, what not to wear, when to be nude, and even though you don't feel comfortable about it. So there's so many things, and if I may quote a fellow researcher and opera singer in Norway, she said, "I never found a role that I could feel comfortable singing." And she has been doing a great career, but she never, through her whole career, felt comfortable portraying a female person on stage. So, yeah.
So quickly, I'd like to give credit to Anushka for this collaboration idea planted in my head. This panel was entirely her creation. So do you have anything to say about your ideas about collaboration?
Yeah, collaboration was kind of the main reason why I think Sarah and I wanted to put this panel together, is to get to interact with other folks that are working in this field, that are kind of thinking through adjacent issues that we are thinking through. This panel has been really fruitful, as well as our conversations outside of this panel, where we're discussing our work, we're collaborating in an informal way. I hope that in the future that can be formal collaborations where papers that are co-authored are weighted, have the same prestige as single-authored papers. And I think collaboration is really kind of the way forward, especially as we're thinking of history as not being this linear narrative, but a series of narratives that can be seen from various vantage points. And I think that will kind of, for me personally, that is an optimism for collaboration.
I have one concluding response. So I'm a singer, but I'm also a taiko player. I'm part of the Japanese American taiko group here on campus. And what I have seen them do I'm part of the group, but seen a lot of these undergraduate students and some grads do, is putting together these collaborative works of art, these festivals, lifting up voices of different marginalized musical communities. And truly, I hope to see that more in musicology as well, and that put on the same plane as publishing. I know the academic machine really values publishing, and I love writing. I'm not against that sort of discourse, but I would love to see these different modes of expression, much as we saw in Nina Eidsheim, using imagery to express these ideas that words could not express. So just concluding thoughts on my end. So let's thank our panelists. Thank you, everyone. And now we will have a quick coffee break.
Let's take 10 minutes. Please be back promptly at 11:30 for our last session of the conference.